recording now, and I'm going to start by having you say and spell your complete name.
My name is Eugene S. Hames. It's spelled E-U-G-E-N-E, middle initial S. The last name is spelled H-A-M-E-S.
And the unit that you served with in the 10th Mountain Division?
From 1943 to 1945.
And the unit?
I was in E Company and Headquarters 2nd of the 86th Regiment at Camp Hale. Then after the division moved to Camp Swift, Texas, I went to Fort Benning. I was commissioned in November of 44. I returned to the division, and I was then assigned to K Company of the 85th Regiment. And I went overseas with the 85th.
And the highest rank served in the 10th Mountain Division?
First Lieutenant.
Okay, great.
In fact, in the Army between Private and First Lieutenant.
So you served as a First Sergeant?
Yes.
Well, what I'd like to do is get some of your background a little bit. How did you come to be in the 10th Mountain Division?
I graduated from high school in Missoula, Montana in the spring of 1937. This was at the end of the Depression, and jobs were available. I went to work in a logging camp that was operated by the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, and I became a timber faller. I worked in the woods for several years, and up until the time I volunteered to go into the Army Ski Troops.
What attracted you to being in the 10th Mountain Division?
I drove into a filling station in Missoula to get some gasoline, and I got talking to the manager of the station, and he told me that if he were as young as I was, he would enlist in the Army Ski Troops at Camp Hale. It's the first time I had heard about it. So then I got busy and wrote to the National Ski Patrol. I sent in my 3 letters of recommendation, and I was accepted.
What attracted you to the 10th Mountain Division?
I think it was rather exciting. I had never skied before. I was looking forward to learning how to ski, and I also wanted to do some mountaineering, and I thought it would be a good place to learn how to do it.
Do you recall who wrote your 3 letters of recommendation?
Yes, I had the superintendent of the logging camp write one. I had the woods foreman write one, and I got one from my old high school principal.
Do you know what was in your letters of recommendation?
I do not. I did not read any of them.
What do you think they might have said?
Oh, it must have been favorable, or they wouldn't have accepted me.
Tell me the date that you enlisted in the 10th Mountain Division.
March 1st, 1943.
And where were you inducted?
I was inducted at Butte, Montana. I was then sent to Fort Douglas, Utah at Salt Lake. I spent about 5 days there, got my uniforms and got the shots the Army required and all that stuff. And then they sent me on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad up to Camp Hale.
What was your impression when you got to Camp Hale?
It was early March, and it was still winter at Camp Hale. A lot of snow on the ground. One of my earliest memories was that all of the men were so sunburned, real dark skin, you know, from being out of doors. And I also was impressed by the overall location of the camp. It was at high altitude. It was almost at the headwaters of the Eagle River, and it was very mountainous terrain.
Were you concerned that working at that altitude might be difficult?
No, not at all. I had been working in the woods for several years, and although we weren't working at that high altitude, hard work and being in the mountains never bothered me at all.
How old were you when you arrived at Camp Hale?
43, I would have been 23.
Now, did you realize that you might have been a little bit older than some of the average privates?
I was very much aware of that.
In what way?
Well, so many of them were just 18, 19 years old, and they had no work experience. Many of them came right out of school into the Army.
And in what way did you feel like that you had more experience, and how did it show up for you?
Well, of course, I felt that working in the woods as long as I did, I learned how to get along with men. There were 200 lumberjacks in camp, and I never had a bit of trouble in all the years I worked there, so I was able to get along with people. I also learned how to do many things, so I didn't learn how to use hand tools like axes and saws and that sort of thing. And I think I learned better how to live with a bunch of men. In the logging camp, we lived in bunkhouses that only had 16 men to a bunkhouse. But in the Camp Hale, of course, there were about 100 men in each barracks.
So your age was actually a benefit to you.
Yes.
And do you think your physical conditioning was, at least as good or better than the average 18 or 19-year-old?
I think it was better than the average. Some of them were in very good shape, but I was really strong. I'd been using a lot of hand tools and falling timber and working outside, and that is hard work.
What's your favorite memory of your training at Camp Hale?
I think skiing at Cooper Hill.
Tell me a little bit about your favorite ski experience at Cooper Hill.
Well, Cooper Hill was serviced by the longest T-bar in the world. It had been built by the Army. And I recall that we were able for 1 week to go up and ride the lift and do a lot of downhill skiing. In fact, that's where I learned how to ski. And that was very satisfying to me, because that's one of the reasons I joined the outfit.
Tell me a little bit about some of your favorite memories of skiing up at Cooper Hill.
Well, if you know the mountain at all, it's not a steep mountain. It's a very gentle slope, actually. But we would ski down only part way and then wait till an empty bar came by and then grab that and go back up so we wouldn't ski the bottom of the mountain. That way we skied the steeper part of the slope.
Did you have some spectacular crashes as you were learning to ski?
Yes, I fell quite a number of times. Fortunately, I was never injured in any way.
What was it like to crash with a loaded pack on your back?
That wasn't pleasant. If the pack weighed around 50 pounds and you fell, the pack normally ended up on top of you and drove you deeper into the snow. And then it was difficult to get out of there and get back on your skis. Many times you had to have some help from one of the other men with you.
When you think about your training at Camp Hale, what was the most difficult part of training there?
To me, I thought rock climbing was. I hasten to say that I never became a very accomplished rock climber. But the times that I did it were all under instruction, and we even used party climbing and pitons and the whole bit. I never felt comfortable rock climbing for some reason, so I just didn't like it.
Can you think about any particular rock climbing experiences that stand out in your memory?
No, not really. I never did fall or never got into any position where I was in any danger, I don't believe.
What was the most difficult experience during training, in particular, where you can remember a particular vivid experience?
Well, I think one of them was the running the obstacle course that we had. As you know, the obstacle course is set up so they fire live ammunition over you as you're crawling through the course, and then they have little dynamite charges set at various places. And one time, one of those explosives went off. I thought it was way too close to where I was. Kind of scared me, although it didn't hurt me.
Tell me a little bit about your experiences on maneuvers.
Well, of course, the greatest maneuver at Camp Hale was the D series. And by that time, I was the first sergeant of Headquarters Company 2nd Battalion. We had, of course, to move over snow. We had to climb mountains. We had to ski down mountains. We had to carry everything on our backs that we were going to use: mountain stoves, sleeping bags, rations, everything. So we had a huge load, you might say, on our backs. The one time I remember clearly, we left Camp Hale one night, and the battalion was to break trail for the whole regiment to move up and occupy an area up toward Vale Pass. Well, my platoon at that time was right at the head of the column, and we broke trail up there for several hours. The snow was heavy. We'd break through, and then we had to climb out. And by the time that I got to the top of the mountain, I was wringing wet, even though it was pretty cold. And I made a vow that night that I never broke. I vowed that if I lived through the war, I would never cross-country ski again, and I haven't.
Well, you've done a fantastic job keeping that one particular vow. I guess my next question, good follow-up, would be, did it seem like work or play? Now that obviously seemed like work, but at times did it seem like play?
I think summer times it felt somewhat like that. The weather was nice, it was cool in the mountains. We might do, say, a 10-mile hike and then bivouac out. That was almost fun because the terrain was so beautiful. The weather was usually nice. Once in a while we'd get a wild lightning storm, but usually the weather was great in the summer. So I thought that was very pleasant.
Tell me a little bit more about what it was like to be a first sergeant.
The first sergeant is the highest ranking non-commissioned officer in the company. And of course he reports directly to the company commander. For most purposes, the first sergeant runs the company, and he keeps the records, like, say, the morning report. That's all done by the first sergeant. The first sergeant also has the job of assigning people to where they're supposed to go. Maybe I remember once we were sent to a mule pack school. Well, he's the one that told us to go there and what we were to do. So the first sergeant really runs the company, and a good first sergeant can make all the difference in the world in a company.
What does it take to be a good first sergeant?
I think you have to be very tough. I think you have to be very firm, but I think you have to be extremely fair to all your men.
Did you have any training experiences that were a little bit dangerous at all?
Oh, not at Camp Hale. Some of the rock climbing could have been. Some of the skiing got a little bit hard when you had a pack and you're on steep, rough terrain. But that was just kind of day-by-day stuff. I don't recall any specific time of being in danger at all.
How hard was it to make skiers into soldiers? Or would it have been easier, do you think, to make soldiers into skiers?
I think it was easier to make soldiers into skiers. I think if you got an average man, say, from 18 to 20 years old, in good physical shape, and put him on the T-bar at Cooper Hill, in a week or two he'd be skiing pretty well.
Overall, did you perceive the training as difficult?
Some of it. You do 25 miles on skis, uphill and down, carrying a 50-pound pack. That's hard work. It's very difficult. Some of the men couldn't do it.
And what happened to them?
Some of them were shipped out.
How did you try and help keep everybody inspired and moving forward and upward?
The best way to do it is by example. And if you're a non-com, first sergeant or a sergeant, so on, you've got to be up front doing it yourself. And by example, then, you show the men what they should be doing.
Did you prefer to be out on maneuvers or in Camp Hale?
In the summertime, I preferred to be outdoors. I loved the camping out, bivouacking, and so on. In the wintertime, on extremely cold weather, I would have preferred to have been in camp.
Did you have a sense during that training time that the 10th Mountain Division was special?
Yes. I always had that feeling.
In what way?
Well, first, most of us were there because we wanted to be there. And when you have a group of volunteers, they normally work harder, they perform their tasks better, and I think we had really a higher caliber of soldier in the 10th Mountain than you would have in a regular infantry outfit.
Talk a little bit about the special camaraderie that you had.
Well, of course, that developed over the period of time that we were there. And of course, day by day, we shared the experiences of being at Camp Hale, whether you were rock climbing in the summer or skiing in the winter, and many times you would pair up with somebody. For example, in the mountain tent, two men slept together in a tent, and you got to know people very well, and you got to know their faults, you got to know what they could do properly, and usually we developed lifelong friendships.
When you got into battle, how did that bond and that strength of relationships help you guys?
Well, with one exception, it kept everybody moving. If you can imagine say a rifle platoon that is supposed to attack a small mountain. It's not easy, and you know that the Germans are there, they're going to be shooting at you, there may be artillery and mortar fire coming in, so you better, if you're the officer, you better be up front leading them in and urging them on. And usually they would respond very well.
When you think about your battle experience in Italy, tell me some of the more memorable experiences that you recall that happened to you.
The worst 2 days that I had in Italy occurred on April 13th and 14th, 1945. At that time, all of the Allied troops moved forward to drive the Germans out of northern Italy, so the whole front was active. My platoon was assigned a small mountain that on the map said 913. It was near Castel, and our job was to leave our position near Castel, cross through an open valley, up the other side, and take the mountain. We jumped off at 8 o'clock, and for some reason, whoever made that decision made a mistake, because as we went off of our mountain and down toward the valley, we started receiving heavy fire immediately. By the time we got into the valley, we could run from one shell hole to the other. I'd run and jump in a shell hole, wait a minute and do the same, and the men we did that going over. Then we finally got across, although we were sustaining casualties right along. Then we went up the mountain and knocked the Germans off. We dug in, the Germans counterattacked one night, we drove them off, and then the next day we left 913 and went again toward a mountain further ahead. And again we ran into heavy fire. The end of that night, when I took roll call of my platoon, I had 11 men left out of 41. And that was bad. Those 2 days, in fact, I think the whole regiment suffered the most casualties there of any 2 days in the war.
As those 2 days were unfolding, what were you thinking?
I was scared. But being scared doesn't mean you don't do your job. You can be scared and still go ahead and perform.
What is it that gets you through?
Pride. I would not have ever wanted anybody to think I was a coward, and I wasn't. But I was scared, and there's a difference.
On the first day when you had to knock the Germans off, what did it take to knock them off, Hill 913?
Primarily grenades and rifle fire. We didn't have any machine guns up there with us. We could have used one very well. But it's small arms fire and hand grenades.
And how fierce was that battle?
It was quite fierce. Germans put up a very determined stand. They knew that if they lost that little string of mountains, that our division was then ready to go out into the Po Valley. So they wanted to hold. That's where the term the last ridge comes from, I think, was that last ridge of mountains there.
Did you have a sense that this was one of the Germans' last stand in that particular area?
Yes. We were quite sure if we knock them off of there that we would be out into the Po Valley.
Before you left Castellano to jump off on that first day on April 13th, did you have any sense that you would be facing unusually stiff resistance?
We knew they would put up quite a bit of resistance, and we hadn't been attacking for a while. This was a planned operation to get all of the divisions moving forward, as I say, to drive the Germans out of Italy. And so it was important, and we knew that the Germans were dug in over there. We had observed them from time to time, and we felt that we were in for a tough fight.
Were you surprised by how tough it was?
No, not really.
What does a first lieutenant do in that particular battle? What did you do during that battle?
Well, of course, I kept the men moving. I watched to make sure that everybody was doing his job. I got after a couple of people and put them in a better firing position. And, of course, I fired my weapon, too, on occasion when I saw a German.
Did you have any sense that it might not work out in your favor at all in that battle?
I don't think I felt that way, but I knew that we had quite a fight on our hands, and I knew I had a lot of casualties.
When you can see that you're losing soldiers under your command, how does that make you feel as their supervisor?
You feel terrible. I knew those men. By April, you see, I had worked with them for several months. They were all good men, some of them very young. One of the men that was killed was an 18-year-old boy from Boston, a great kid, and I hated to lose him.
During the counterattack, tell me what happened to you during the counterattack.
Well, by that time, we had used the German positions that they had dug. We got in those and enlarged them a little bit and used them to resist the Germans. So we were in pretty good shape then. We had some cover. It wasn't like coming up that mountain after them.
When you were coming up that mountain after them, did you ever wonder if you would survive it?
Yes. I thought about it.
Tell me a little bit about what it was like for you to go up that mountain.
It's scary. And it's a lot of chaos and noise. And I always felt in a way that I was lucky that I was an officer, because I had a lot of jobs to do. And it kept me busy. I didn't have time to, say, worry about getting hit. I had things to do, and I did them.
As an officer, what was your primary responsibility?
The safety of my men.
What were the major challenges?
Well, of course, in an attack, it was obviously enemy fire. At other times, it was long-range fire, artillery, mortar fire, that sort of thing. And, of course, I had out a lot of patrols before that, and out on patrol sometimes we were fired on, or someone would trip a mine or something. So there's all different ways of getting hurt.
Talk to me a little bit about the importance of artillery in battle. How important is artillery?
Artillery is very important. And if you have a good artillery unit, you can really lay down a heavy covering fire like the Germans did when we came off the mountain there by Castel and started to cross. They really blasted that area. Now, they don't get everybody, but they get enough so that it reduces the effectiveness of the attacking troops.
Did you feel that German artillery was superior?
I believe so. I think they had a little better artillery than we did.
Talk a little bit about how it impacted the battle at 9/13.
I didn't hear him.
How did German artillery impact you at Hill 9/13?
Well, of course, it effectively reduced my platoon strength. I don't know exactly how many men we lost coming across that open area, but quite a few. So that cut down our effectiveness, and we weren't the only ones getting shelled. Everybody was suffering the same thing.
Talk a little bit about how American artillery helped compensate for German artillery, and how it helped pave the way for what the rifle companies had to do.
Well, I have to speak only from watching the artillery land. I had nothing to do with shooting artillery pieces, but our artillery was quite effective, and before we attacked, we would normally shell the object, whatever we were going to try to attack. And our artillery, I thought, was very good, but I just had the feeling that the Germans might have been a little better in that regard.
Do you think you might have used up 9 lives in the course of your battle experience?
Possibly.
Tell me about one life that you might have used up.
Well, my runner and I were running up the hill, and an artillery shell came in. He was to my right, and the shell was to his right. He was wounded, and I was knocked off my feet, but I wasn't wounded. So I think that's one of them.
Can you think of a second life you might have used up?
Well, there were other instances, but I think that's the main one.
What was your encounter with the Germans? Did you have much close contact with surrendering Germans?
Yes. I couldn't speak German, but a couple of men in the platoon could, and we were able to converse with them.
What was your sense of their attitude as they were surrendering?
Well, I think it was typical. They knew they were beaten. They looked rather haggard. They looked rather unhappy. And most of them, I think, realized the war was over for them.
Did you have any feelings of empathy towards them or antipathy?
No, none whatsoever.
Either way. Did you ever have, by chance, encounter SS troops?
No.
Now, sometimes you'll run into little funny experiences that happen in the midst of war. Sometimes it's just the irony of certain experiences. Can you think of any lighter moments that might have occurred to you in the course of your experiences in battle?
Right offhand, I can't. I'm sorry.
How about any chance encounters with partisans or Italian civilians?
I had a lot of contact with several partisans. I mentioned to you that I did some patrolling, and many of the patrols I took out, we took a partisan with us. He knew the terrain. He was familiar with the area. So he would kind of guide us and show us where to go. They were very helpful.
What was your feeling from them about their attitudes towards the 10th?
Well, I think they thought the world of the 10th. And I think the Italian people generally felt that we had liberated them, that we weren't conquerors.
After the war, did you have any contact with any of the partisans that you had met during the war?
No, I have not.
Did you ever have any experience with either side of the combatants not following Geneva Conventions?
I saw the Germans shell some ambulances, our ambulances had the Red Cross on them, and the ambulances were going down to pick up some wounded, and the Germans shelled them. I think that's contrary to the Geneva Convention.
Where was that?
I think it was near the town of Catigliano.
Did you have a sense that that sort of occurrence happened regularly?
I can't answer that. I don't know. That's the only time that I saw it.
When you saw that, how did you feel about that?
I felt pretty. Excuse me. I felt pretty bad because they were going in to pick up some wounded, and they should have been permitted to do that.
Could you believe that they were doing it?
It was kind of hard to believe it, but it was obvious that's what they were doing.
Did you ever find out how it worked out for the people in the ambulances?
No, I know nothing about that.
Tell me a little bit about events that led up to receiving a Bronze Star.
Well, we were in an attack position on, I think this was on Belvedere, and my platoon was given a job of taking the right flank of the mountain, and the Germans pretty well had us pinned down. There were a lot of fire coming in, and I knew if we stayed there that we were going to be hurt. So I got up and reconnoitered and found a way to go around the German position and up to where they were. So I came back and got the platoon, led them up there, and then we took the resistance out without losing very many people. So they awarded me the Bronze Star for that.
As you were coming up Belvedere, can you describe to me the events as they unfolded for you?
Yes, the main attack on Belvedere was a night attack. And the 3rd Battalion of the 85th was the unit that took it. We moved up the mountain after dark. We had been instructed not to load our rifles, so if a rifle was fired, we'd know it was German. We were told to fix bayonets, and we started up the mountain. The Germans had a lot of mortar fire, and it was centered in the valleys. If there was kind of a ridge and one over here, they had the mortar fire because they felt we would move up through those low areas. Well, by moving up on the ridges, we avoided a lot of that mortar fire. When we got to the top of the mountain, it was just about daylight, and when I got there, as I recall, the Germans had just surrendered. So I did not do any actual fighting at the top of Belvedere at that time.
What were you thinking as you jumped off and started going up Belvedere?
Well, again, I was quite concerned about the men and myself. That was one of our first actual combat experiences. I was very concerned about how I would react as an individual. Would I be able to perform my job? And I was scared. But I was able to perform it and carry out my duties, and we got up there in good shape.
What was the most difficult part about those events?
I think the noise and the inability to communicate with other men. It was dark. We couldn't use hand and arm signals, and we just didn't know really what was going on except right where we were.
Describe what the chaos of battle is like for you.
The what?
Describe what the chaos of battle is like.
Well, it's very upsetting and very it requires a lot of attention to keep your mind on what you're doing with all the noise and being dark and men hollering, and it's just kind of a chaotic scene, and you just have to make up your mind to do your job and not let it bother you too much.
What do you think is the secret to success for the 10th Mountain Division in Italy?
I think the division had a lot of fine troops. I think they were well trained, and I think they used that training very well to accomplish their mission in Italy.
How do you think the 10th made a difference in Italy?
Well, of course, we made a huge difference when we took Riva and Belvedere, because that knocked the Germans off of the two highest terrain features in the area. And then we later took some of the lower mountains and we knocked them out of their best defensive position.
What do you think can be learned from the 10th Mountain Division?
Well, of course, you have to understand, I guess, the military mind. I think you have to have pride in your organization. You have to respect the men and the officers that you served with. And you have to know that you may be asked to even give up your life, but you're willing to do it because of the men with you and because of your pride in the unit.
Can you tell me, were you ever wounded in battle?
No, I was not.
Did you make it through without a scratch?
Yes.
What was the closest shave you had? And I don't mean a face shaving.
Probably the time I mentioned the artillery shell that wounded my runner and knocked me down. I could have very easily been seriously wounded there.
How about if you tell me a little bit about some of your most memorable battle experiences that occurred right before the end of the war?
After the division captured all of the mountains in the Apennines, we then moved. I was going to say that after the division captured all of the Apennine Mountains, we then moved out into the Po Valley. The Germans were retreating, and the American troops, including the 10th Mountain Division, were anxious to reach the Po River. In order for the 10th Mountain Division to participate, General Hayes set up a task force. It was called Task Force Duff, D-U-F-F. Duff was the assistant division commander, and he was placed in charge of the task force. K Company, that I was with, was one of the companies assigned to the task force. Now they wanted us to get to the Po River as soon as we could, so they brought up a bunch of trucks and they loaded 2 rifle companies into the trucks. My platoon was about halfway back in the convoy as we started north toward the Po River. We hadn't gone more than 5 or 6 hours when we heard small arms fire up toward the head of the column. So we were pretty sure someone had fired on us. Of course, the column stopped, everybody got out, we took up firing positions. We didn't really know what was going to happen. Well, within a very short time, a runner came back and told me to bring my platoon up to the front of the column, that they had a special mission for me. I did that, and my mission was to stay there at the head of the column and clear out the buildings. There was kind of an intersection there, and the rest of the task force was going to bypass that resistance. Now, they didn't know what was in there. They knew they had been fired on, but they left my platoon, and the rest of the division kept on going north, and they took all the trucks with them. They didn't even leave me a truck. So we started clearing out the buildings. There was some shooting. The Germans fired at us. I think there were 3 Germans wounded and 4 killed, and I didn't have any casualties. But then, once we cleared those buildings, the Germans started surrendering. They would come out of buildings with the rifle up overhead, and we started taking prisoners. Now that went on until we had more prisoners than I had men. And I was kind of doubtful as to what I should do with them. We took their weapons away, of course, and had them all together in one area, but I didn't really know where I should go. Well, the rest of the task force had gone north, so I decided to go north. Well, as we went north, Germans would come out of the buildings and gave up. It was just kind of a mass surrender at that time. By the time we got to a little town of Bomporto, we turned the prisoners over to some MPs. We had 360 Germans.
Were you a little worried about being so outnumbered?
Yes, I was, but of course they were unarmed in their group, and all of my men were armed, and they kind of moved down the highway with men alongside, men in front and behind. So we made it very well. And that's written up, by the way, in the regimental history.
Did the Germans seem relieved to be in this surrendering position?
I think they were. I think I detected some of them feeling that, well, the war is over for us. We can go home now, you know. The other thing that happened toward the end of the war, after we crossed the Po River, we went to Verona and captured it. Then we moved over toward Lake Garda. And it was a very fluid situation. There were Germans ahead of us, fleeing, trying to get back to the Alps, and then we were trying to catch them. We were going up the east side of Lake Garda, and the Germans occupied the west side of the lake. On the afternoon we got to the lake, we could see some German vehicles over there with field glasses, and no American troops had been over there. We marched up that side of the lake all one day, and then we held up for the night. And the next morning, I was sent back to battalion headquarters for a special mission. Well, I went back to battalion, and by the way, Jim Barr was not there at that time. He had been wounded at the when he was in I can't think of the name now. When we were in the Po River country, he was wounded. Now, I went back to battalion, and what they wanted me to do was take a small motorboat and 10 men and cross Lake Garda that afternoon and secure the villa where Mussolini had been living. They had the boat. I went back to the company area, and the boat was already there, quite a large motorboat. It would have seated 10 of us very well. I started getting volunteers like you, you, and you. You're going with me. And we also were looking to see if we could find some more automatic weapons. We didn't have enough firepower, I didn't think. So as we were doing that, a Jeep drove up. There was a driver, of course, and a full colonel sitting in the driver's seat, and he had a 10th Mountain patch on. Well, I thought I'd seen all of the senior officers of the division, but I'd never seen this man before. But I went over and reported to him, and he said, "Lieutenant, what are you doing?" Well, I explained my mission to him. I'm going to take the boat, cross the lake that afternoon, and secure the villa. Now, I should tell you this. When Italy surrendered, Mussolini moved to northern Italy and set up a puppet government. And he lived in the villa during that period of time. He personally resided there. So I guess they were perhaps hopeful that we'd catch Mussolini. But anyway, after I told the colonel that, he said, "I don't like this, Lieutenant." And I said, "I don't either, sir." Well, I was talking to William Darby, who was our new assistant division commander. Duff had been wounded at the Po River, so he had left, and it then became Task Force Darby. Well, I was talking to Colonel Darby. I didn't know it at the time. Well, Darby canceled our daylight excursion. He ordered up a bunch of these big Army ducks, and we crossed Lake Garda the next night. We left the West Bank about 1 o'clock in the morning, crossed the lake, got landed okay, moved down to the villa, and not a shot was fired.
What would have been the hazards of doing the originally planned daylight crossing?
Well, almost anybody with any kind of a weapon could have given us fits. A man with a rifle could have picked us off. A guy with a machine gun would have just wiped us out. And that's what I was afraid of. Because we had no armament on the boat, and obviously we'd have been a sitting duck.
Tell me a little bit about what Mussolini's villa was like.
Pardon?
What was Mussolini's villa like?
Well, it was a very unique 3-story building, nicely furnished. The outside of that building at that time was kind of a green color. It had a lot of bedrooms, I'd say 8 or 10, had a large kitchen, and behind the villa and dug into the bank was a bomb shelter. It was right on the lake, so they had a dock, and someone had destroyed a nice motorboat by apparently putting a white phosphorus grenade in it, and they sunk it right there at the dock. And in the garage, they did the same to a big old black touring car. There must have been some kind of an official village.
When you arrived there, were you nervous about what you might find?
Yeah, we were uncertain. I didn't know it at the time, but Mussolini had left there 12 days before we got there.
What was your experience once you got into Mussolini's villa?
Well, of course, it was great being inside. We had beds to sleep on. I took over the large bedroom that I assume was his. We had a kitchen where we could cook eggs and fish, things like that to vary our diet. And it was really nice to be inside like that.
Tell me what the bedroom situation was like.
Well, as I say, there were 8 or 10. I didn't count them. I took over the biggest one, and one of my sergeants slept with me. Then we assigned the other beds out. I think every man almost had a bed or shared a bed with somebody.
Now, when you say you took over the biggest bedroom, whose bedroom might that have been?
Probably Mussolini's.
What was it like?
Very plush. He didn't lack for anything. There was also a very interesting building that we called the pharmacy. Mussolini was very ill toward the end of his life. And in this room were all kinds of medicines and powders, and it looked like a pharmacy. And it was just stacked full of stuff.
When you were in Mussolini's villa, was it filled with his objects still?
Yes, I don't think that he had taken much with him. All the furniture was there, and there were a bunch of smaller items that most of the men picked up as souvenirs. And as I say, they wrecked the one car and they wrecked the boat, and that's all the damage that they did before he pulled out.
After armistice, did you go up to the Yugoslavian-Austrian border?
Not then, I did not. No. I might add, too, this story has an unhappy ending. We crossed Lake Garda on April 30th. The war ended 2 days later on June the 2nd. Colonel Darby was killed the day before the war ended on the upper end of Lake Garda. And with him at the time was the sergeant major of the 86th, a man whose name was Timmy Evans, whom I knew very well, and both of them were killed instantly.
Talk a little bit about how you did go up to the Yugoslavian border to help stabilize the border.
Well, I think they left us in the villa the better part of a week, and then they brought some trucks over and they started moving us over to the east, and we went to a little town called Cividale, which is north of Udine.
What was your role up there?
We were doing patrolling, and for want of a better term, I suppose we were then occupation troops.
Did you feel like it was a lot of tension? Did you feel like it was very fluid?
No, I didn't think there was a lot of tension there. We saw some Yugoslavian troops several times. We had no problem with them. We didn't socialize with them or anything, but they never threatened us and we didn't threaten them. I'd add,
What do you think is the 10th Mountain spirit?
oh, they're very adventuresome. They're very brave. They also show quite a concern for such things as our country, and they are very loyal to the United States.
What does it mean to you to have been part of the 10th Mountain Division?
Well, I think it was probably the greatest singular thing that ever happened to me. And not only the service that I participated in, but it changed my life completely after the military. I went to college, which I could never do before. I met my wife at Camp Carson, and we got married. I went to law school at the University of Minnesota, became an attorney, practiced law in Denver for many years. So I had an entirely different life than I ever had before.
What kind of legacy does the 10th Mountain Division leave?
A very honorable one, I think. We did our job, and I think we did a good job, and I think most people realize that.
Would you think that the current 10th Mountain Division carries the torch for what you guys originally did?
I think so, and men who have been there and who have met them have been very impressed by the current men in the 10th Mountain.
Can you think of anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
No, I think not. I think we've covered my part of the war pretty well.